Hello, this is Brian. Today is Wednesday, May 31st, 2023, and I am near Big Rock Park here in Santee, and it's time for a Spotlight on Shrubs video. So today, I want to focus on the third main variety of California buckwheat that is found here in Southern California. There may be another, again, I might have mentioned in previous videos, there might be another variety or subspecies I can't remember the name of, but it doesn't occur in this area. But out of the three that occur here in southwestern California, including the mountains and some of the desert areas, is another variety of California buckwheat. But today, let's focus on Foothill or Leafy California buckwheat. And this is Eriogonum fasciculatum variety foliolosum. So this will complete this series of three buckwheats I've encountered, three varieties of the same species that I have encountered on my hikes, from coastal bluffs to 6,000 plus feet in the mountains to the edge of the desert transition. So this one here is the leafy one that is found mostly in the foothills away from the immediate coast, one that tolerates some hotter and slightly drier conditions during the summer, a little more heat tolerant, I believe, and very similar to the other varieties, especially more similar to the coastal buckwheat because of its typically rich green color, which is pretty typical on the coastal one. The coastal one for review is Eriogonum fasciculatum variety fasciculatum, which is also also known as the coastal buckwheat, coastal California buckwheat. Variety foliolosum comes from the Latin name foliolosum, which means leafy, and it's quite a leafy shrub, so it's a pretty accurate description. So what we have is a mounding to sometimes quite upright shrub, as you see here, and it's an evergreen shrub, mostly evergreen. Sometimes it might shed some leaves in the most horrible of drought. It might be some slight drought deciduous characteristics, but generally evergreen. And it's a member of the buckwheat / knotweed family, the Polygonaceae. And it's a very woody shrub, especially at its base. And as typical with our Eriogonum fasciculatum varieties, the leaves are quite narrow, green colored. However, there are some very, very slight differences that you really have to look at carefully to determine what variety you're looking at, especially in an area where they can integrate. And this one does potentially integrate with the coastal buckwheat, potentially as far inland as here, because I believe CalFlora does voucher Eriogonum fasciculatum variety fasciculatum in the Santee area, and that's where I am, in the city of Santee. So we're kind of in transition between where you'd mostly find the coastal buckwheats closer to the ocean and the leafy buckwheat that predominates in the foothills, which is also another name for it, the Foothill California buckwheat. So as you can see, they get these very intricately branched pom-poms of flowers in late spring through a nice chunk of the summer months. So usually by May, you start seeing the flowers really open up. And as you go through June and July, these plants explode. And sometimes into August, September, and sometimes you'll still see flowers on them in October. And I've even seen some with flowers still in November. So they have a very long flowering period. And buckwheats are very highly praised by apiarists, the people who cultivate bees for honey, because this plant is a very important bee plant. Most of our buckwheats are, whether they're the shrubby buckwheats or these big buckwheats here. Very important bee plants. Bees love buckwheats. That's all I can say. Bees love buckwheats. They're supposed to make a good honey. Now, the seeds of a lot of our buckwheat species are purportedly supposed to be good for use in famine. I don't believe our buckwheats, our local buckwheats, are supposed to be very tasty, and I don't really know a whole lot about the ethnobotanical uses of it. That's kind of, that's usually not my strongest point in botany, is the ethnobotanical portions. I guess guilty, got to do a little more research on it so I can make these videos even more interesting, hopefully. Hopefully you think they are. But a lot of species of buckwheat are known for, you know, you can use their seeds, I believe, culinarily. I don't know the specifics about these. Like I said, my ethnobotany is not the strongest, but a little more research would probably be prudent before just grabbing seeds out of the wild and popping them in your mouth, which would probably not taste very good. But I'm going to start going into some of the specific characteristics of the leafy or foothill buckwheat after I snatch a couple of general photographs of this plant. Okay, so how do I know I'm looking at a leafy California buckwheat? Well, look at these really broad pom-poms. Really broad pom-poms. But more importantly, I look at the characteristics of the leaves. And this is not easy. You kind of really have to look carefully in here. So having good eyesight is probably a good idea. But one thing about the leafy California buckwheat, besides it being, well, leafy as heck, is that you really look carefully at the leaves. They're mostly medium to darker green, maybe a slight gentle fuzziness on top. But one thing you want to look for is the underside of the leaves. Now, if I can get it in focus here. The underside of the leaves are supposed to be the most tightly down curled of all of our varieties here, of our 3 main varieties here in southwestern California. So the leaf edges will have the most curling. The other varieties, variety fasciculatum, the coastal buckwheat, also has a degree of revolute edges, in other words, curling down at the edges. But the leafy one is supposed to have the tightest curling under of the leaf edges. I'm going to take an old leaf here. Let's see. And of course, you're going to notice that more on the smaller leaves. But if you look carefully, you can see that the edges of the leaves are very tightly curled under. This variety, Eriogonum fasciculatum variety foliolosum, has the tightest curling of the leaf edges of the 3 varieties. The coastal buckwheat does also have curling of the leaves, but it's a lot less noticeable. Or at least a little bit less noticeable. Probably should be more proper that way. And the Mojave Desert buckwheat, Eriogonum fasciculatum variety foliolosum, which you have to go really far inland, mostly in the mountains and the desert side of the mountains. That one, the leaves might have some curling under, or they might not have any curling under as well. And those leaves on the Mojave one tend to have a little bit more of a grayish hue. Although that can occasionally happen on our leafy California buckwheats. So let's look at these pom-poms of flowers. Very nicely branched, intricately branched. Beautiful 5 petals. 1, 2, 3, 4. Some of these petals look like they're at least 6-petaled flowers with pink stamens on them. If you look carefully, you can see the pink stamens on them. You won't see it on the video, but the flowers are beautiful on this plant. And they often have a little bit of, the petals tend to have a little bit of a cup shape. In other words, kind of cupped, radiating out from the center of the flower. And what looks like a little tiny pinkish hue in the center of it. And again, with pink stamens. And the buds themselves they start out pink as well. So it's a very attractive plant. It has a very long blooming period. So what I want to do is take a look here at the bark. the bark of our buckwheats, and this is pretty common for a lot of our woody buckwheats, and that's not just Eriogonum fasciculatum and its varieties, but other species of buckwheats as well that have woody bases. And that includes some of the small ground-hugging plants that you find high up in the mountains. But a lot of our buckwheat bark has really attractive stringy furrows, kind of a gray to a grayish brown color, that when you get down the stem, it gets quite shreddy. Very attractive bark on buckwheat. Now, I told you what the name foliolosum means, the subepithet, the variety name. But what does fasciculatum mean? Now, fasciculatum refers to the arrangement of the leaves on the stem. The leaves are fascicled in bundles, or fasces, F-A-S-C-E-S. So that's where the name fasciculatum comes from. As you look here on the sides of the stems, look at how the leaves are bundled in alternating arranged fascicles. The leaves are bundled in alternating fascicles down the stem. So that's where the name fasciculatum comes from in the species name for the California buckwheat as a general species. And our three varieties exhibit this fascicled leaf arrangement. So if it's not in bloom, it might potentially be confused with another fasciculatum plant, and that's Eriogonum fasciculatum, the chamise, which also has fascicled leaves arranged very similarly along the stem. However, depending on what variety of chamise you're looking at, the common typical chamise has very narrow needle-like leaves. So that's one way you can tell. These leaves are not needle-like. They definitely have a little bit of a width that will distinguish them from chamise. And B, there's another variety of chamise, Eriogonum fasciculatum variety foliolosum. Eriogonum fasciculatum variety obtusifolium. I apologize for that. I'm doing a foliolosum video, but Eriogonum fasciculatum variety obtusifolium, the coastal chamise, has short, stubby, little, fleshy, little tiny needle-like leaves. So, and the flower arrangement is very different. So, if you're looking at these kind of flat top, sometimes pom-pom shape or rounded flower clusters, you're looking at a buckwheat. If you're looking at a cone shape panicle, that's a chamise. Unfortunately, there's not a chamise around here to contrast it with. Except on the hills there, that's all chamise over there. But common chamise has upright flower clusters that are small and 5-petaled, and they're upright, whereas these ones are a little bit more horizontally clustered. So if you see them in bloom, cone-shaped flowers, really needle-like leaves, chamise. Slightly wider leaves, flat top clusters or rounded clusters, buckwheat. All right, so let me get a couple pictures of some of the other features of this plant, and we'll go ahead and finish this off. All right, so finishing this off, let's take another look at the bark. I told you the bark on this plant is very, very beautiful and shreddy towards the bottom, and you get some more brown in it. So sometimes the foothill variety, a lot of times the foothill variety can be more upright. As you see here, some of these are quite upright. The coastal one can be upright as well, and I've seen them get good several feet tall. But a lot of them can also be quite prostrate, growing on the ground. These ones tend to be a little bit more upright. Again, not a 100% telltale sign. But a very good garden plant, especially if you like having bees and wildlife. This is the type of plant you definitely want to have. Very drought hardy, very heat tolerant, has a fair amount of cold tolerance. It'll easily grow if you live here in the foothills. But what an amazing little plant. So, the next question, what kind of habitat does this species prefer? Well, there are quite a few different habitats you'll find this plant growing in, especially coastal sage scrub, disturbed open sites. Buckwheat can colonize open and disturbed sites pretty decently. Like this area's obviously been disturbed a lot by trails and foot traffic and stuff like that. These plants do like open areas, grassy areas, very sunny areas. These plants love to be out in the sun, so a lot of times you'll find them a lot on south-facing slopes, but not exclusively. They'll grow where they can get a foothold. These plants can be very, very prominent in the landscape, which is great because it's a native plant and has a lot of wildlife value. So, coastal sage scrub. This is kind of like coastal sage scrub here because we do have a lot of related plants that grow with it, such as Artemisia californica, California sagebrush. This beautiful fragrant plant here. It grows with a lot of sages, monkey flowers, prickly pear cactus, laurel sumac, these large evergreen shrubs here on the hillside. A lot of times with broom Baccharis cerathoides. So, but it also will grow in more open areas of chaparral. So it does grow in chaparral, but typically in more open areas and along the sides of trails, where it has a little more open access. It likes to be a little bit more out in the open. And sometimes you'll find them colonizing meadows and grasslands, whether they're native or non-native, because buckwheats tend to compete pretty well with a lot of the non-native plants. And then sometimes occasionally you'll see them in the understory of woodlands, oak woodlands sometimes, but they typically like to be more out in the sun. So there you have it. Check on the screen for the full range of this plant, but it is a very common plant here in Southern California. Very common, especially in hilly areas, foothills, more south-facing slopes and canyons, lower mountain slopes, before it gets replaced by Mojave buckwheat higher up and replaced more towards the ocean by the coastal California buckwheat. But there you have it, Eriogonum fasciculatum variety foliolosum. Live from here in Santee, my now hometown. Thanks for watching my spotlight, and I'll see you on the next episode.